Minimize this. Hello, everyone. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Marissa. I am the archivist and project manager for the Washington State Jewish Historical Society. I also collect hats. I'm currently wearing a vintage hat from Frederick and Nelson. And tonight I am really excited to talk to you about the care and preservation of photographs. Before I start, just a couple of housekeeping rules. We are keeping the chat open just so you can comment or ask questions, but everyone will be muted during the presentation. After the presentation is over, we'll open things up for questions. So I come from the perspective that historic objects don't just exist in a museum or even an archive. Our own history is as equally important, and we all have something significant to share. It's so important to consider not only our connection to the past, but also that history is created every day. I don't know how many of you fancy yourselves archivists, but at the end of this presentation tonight, you should have the tools on how to preserve and care for your own family photographs. I'm also going to be sharing photographs from my family's collection that hopefully may inspire you to share some of your own. This is tonight's agenda. I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction for those of you who may not be familiar with the Washington State Jewish Historical Society or what our mission is. I'm going to talk a little bit about our new archival management system, permanent.org. Then I'm going to talk about the importance of photographs, different types of photographs. Probably my favorite part of this presentation, family secrets and how to look for clues, the do's and don'ts of photo preservation, to digitize or not to digitize, but Facebook, share some resources, and then open things up for questions. The Washington State Jewish Historical Society's mission statement is to preserve and present the history of Jewish life in Washington State. The Society fosters awareness and appreciation of the experiences, the diverse culture, and the significant contributions of Jews past and present. We build bridges with communities by sharing the stories of our collective history and serving as an educational resource. The last sentence really exemplifies just what we do as an organization. So our origins start in the late 1960s when a determined group of community volunteers concerned that Jewish history was disappearing took on the mission of preserving and collecting documents recording local Jewish history from both Washington State and the Puget Sound region. Today, the Jewish Archives at the University of Washington forms a culmination of our work, providing a valuable resource to the local Jewish community, as well as researchers of Jewish history in Washington State. It is quite a fantastic collection, and some of the highlights include over 400 oral histories and 3,700 digitized photographs dating from the 1800s to the present day. As this is a presentation on photographs, I chose two of my favorite images from the collection. The image on the right is Congregation Berker Shalom MH from 1916, a photograph in the snow. And the image on the left, all of these lovely ladies wearing hats are from left to right, Mrs. Alex Bridge, her aunt, Mrs. Joseph Bridge, mother of Ben Bridge and Abe Bridge, and Franny Flaxbridge. It's undated, but my guess is based on the fashion as well as the hats, it's probably from 1910s to 1920. So I'm gonna tell you a little bit about our new archival management system. We are using a platform called permanent.org. And we will actively be soliciting feedback as well as potentially piloting scanning sessions starting early next year. I presented recently at the 2022 DigiPress conference in Baltimore. We're also in the early stages of development. We're still building out the foundation of our archival management system, but alongside it, we really hope to offer more community-based workshops like this in the future. And lastly, follow us on social media for just more sneak peeks of behind the scenes. One last thing to announce before I start is after this presentation is over, we will be sending out a short survey to get feedback on this event, as well as potential events we might have in the future. It's only 6 questions and should only take a few moments to fill out. Your feedback is extremely important because it gives us the opportunity to know what topics you may like to see for future programming, as well as how much you liked this event tonight. Again, it's a very short survey and will only take a few minutes to fill out. Okay, let's start. So you've all heard the phrase, "a picture says 1,000 words," or perhaps a variation of this. Well, what does that mean exactly? I believe it means that you can look at a photograph and come up with your own narrative without having a detailed description, a caption. You don't need to know a different language or even be familiar with a different culture in order to understand what is happening. A photograph offers a unique narrative, one that is easy to understand or be moved by. This isn't a cute photo of a dog or a cat that you might see on social media, but it is still a very touching and sentimental image. This photograph is from the early 1950s. This is a photograph of my grandfather on the right and my dad as a little baby. It's nostalgic, sweet, and extremely tender. But how do you identify the people in this photograph? How do you date photographs? How do you care and preserve them for future generations? These are some of the questions that I hope to answer tonight. As an aside, this presentation will not be a discussion about what to do with all the photographs you may have on your phone, but I really want you to walk away with a greater appreciation and understanding of the value a photograph can have. Now I'm going to talk about different types of photographs. You're welcome to take notes during this section, but I will be sending out supplementary material after this presentation is over with more detailed information. This is probably the more technical part of the evening. Why is this important? It's important to know what type of photographs you might have in order to best take care of them as well as date them. So I also want to mention there are many, many other types of photographs this list does not include, but these may be some of the more common ones that you may see in your own family collections. So not everyone will have a daguerreotype, but you may discover that you have a photograph that is a daguerreotype that you didn't necessarily know that you had before. So daguerreotypes date from about, one last thing to mention. So notice all of the dates on these photographic types. And you'll notice that there is certainly a bit of an overlap between some of the photos. Just because a new type of photography was developed does not necessarily mean that it supersedes the old. So the first type of photograph on this list is called a daguerreotype. It dates from 1839 to about 1860. It's the earliest practical photographic process and is very suited to portraiture. Because daguerreotypes are fragile, they usually come in protective cases, often made of leather and lined with silk or velvet. An embryotype is similar to a daguerreotype, but it was actually called the instant photography of its day because portraits could be made in just a few minutes. Why sitters waited. A tintype is less expensive, but it is more durable than the previous two. They did not require protective cases and were often kept in simple paper frames or folders. Just a fun fact for everyone, tintypes are made out of metal, and if you put a magnet to it, it'll stick. Crayon portraits. So the image on the left is an example of a crayon portrait. It's a very faint photographic image, which is just then finished in charcoal or pastel. They were usually done on matte surface paper and often give the appearance of a drawing or painting. As an aside, the image on the left is actually a portrait of my great-great-grandmother. I saw this in my grandmother's house quite often when I was younger, and I had always wondered for the longest time why it didn't quite look like a photograph or quite look like a painting. Next, we have album prints. A good example is the image on the right. This is one of the most common photographs of the 19th century. The paper is extremely thin, and they are usually placed on a thick mount, usually cardboard. And the image on the right is also a certain type of print called a carte de vite. Gelatin silver prints. Most 20th century black and white photographs are gelatin silver prints. They are still used today. If someone develops a print in a dark room, this is what someone might use. Nitrocellulose film. I don't know how many of you are familiar with nitrate film, but it's the same type of highly unstable combustible material. And nitrate film can be identified with the embossed word nitrate on the edge of the film. Safety film, a little bit more stable than nitrate, but unfortunately very susceptible to deterioration. The film often shrinks if it's in poor storage conditions and will smell like vinegar. Polaroid, I'm sure most of you are familiar with Polaroids. Instant photography, an image will develop minutes or even seconds after somebody takes it. Was revised recently, even though this says 2009. Polyester, which is more modern. It is probably the best for archival use as it does not deteriorate and is not as affected as much for temperature change or humidity. And last, we have digital cameras, which are easy to use and do not require chemicals or paper to process. All right, let's move on to family secrets. So what happens if we don't know anything at all about a photograph? Well, it is certainly fun to imagine what might be taking place, even if we don't know the entire story. Let's look at this photograph and try and take a guess about what's taking place, as well as what date it might be from. So we can see that people are dressed fairly formally, so it's most likely a formal occasion, although not necessarily, because people certainly did dress up more in the past than they do now. The clothing certainly looks like it's from the late 40s, maybe 50s, based on the hats and dresses. The people in the photo are a mixture of older and younger folks, although interestingly enough, there's no children. What about the woman in the back, the one who's dressed very confidently in the ruffles, the stripes, and the giant hat? I wish I could tell you that she was my grandmother's second cousin and a bit of a black sheep who led a very adventurous life and absconded to Europe with a count. Unfortunately, none of that is true, but it certainly is fun to imagine. This photograph is from my grandparents' wedding, which took place in 1948. And I know this because it came from a photo album with the date of their wedding on it. And it took place at a house, most likely my grandfather's boss. My grandfather was a lawyer, and I know this after talking to my dad and my aunt about it. However, there is very little that I know about this photograph. My grandmother passed away when I was much younger, and I don't know who any of these people are. Needless to say, the lady in the fantastic ruffled dress. So how do you find out information about a photograph if you don't have any data? It's almost like you have to be an investigator and look for family secrets or look for clues. So these are 10 ways that you can use clues to help you identify photographs. A modern day phone can be considered an archivist of sort, as it can sort photographs by category, date, location, and even identify people. However, we have to do a little bit more investigative research to come up with this type of information. So we look for clues. The first clue is check for written clues. Does the photograph have any details which might point towards its age? For example, does it have the studio name of the photographer? You can also look at handwritten notes on the back of a photograph, including names, events, or location. It may require a bit of detective work, but even a few words, such as family camping trip or Marissa's 10th birthday, can be extremely helpful. Step 2, analyze the fashion and hairstyle. The woman on the lower left or the lower right, her hairstyle certainly is of a certain era and perhaps a little bit easier to date than some of the others. But if there are people in the photo, it's important to look at what they're wearing, as fashion can be very useful. Look at their hair, look at their clothing. Are there any clues that might help you date the photograph? One interesting thing to note is that women's fashion developed faster than men's fashion, and younger women tended to be more likely to wear contemporary clothing. Step 3, consider uniforms and medals. A person in a uniform can usually make a photograph easier to date. This is often the case for photographs that are taken in the 20th century, when uniforms became more standardized. Unfortunately, for earlier photographs, uniforms can be a little harder to identify, but certainly do add to the mystery. Step 4, look at the background and other objects. While some photographs may offer nothing, especially if your photo depicts a group of people standing in a field, it can often be full of useful clues. You may be able to tell what city or town or even neighborhood the photograph was taken, especially if you can identify specific buildings. See the old car in the image on the top left, fairly easy to identify, and see the image on the top right of the more contemporary cars. And one thing that's really important to consider is don't overlook the details. They may be small, but often they can provide vital clues. Step 5, don't forget to ask. This is so important. And if you don't remember anything else, please remember this. If you have living family members with a connection to the photograph, don't forget to ask for their input. Sitting down with someone and giving them time to reminisce over a photograph may be the most useful thing that you can do. Oftentimes, they can remember or even identify people in a photograph, and this is so, so important. Step 6, look at the format. This is mostly for older photographs, but could still be considered useful. Different types of formats rose and fell in the 19th century as photography developed. Look at how the image is surrounded and housed. If it is in the protective case, it may be a daguerreotype and was taken before the 1880s. If it's mounted on a thick card, it could be a carte de visite, dating from the 1850s. Step 7, check the support of the photograph. A wide variety of materials have been used to print or lay the image of a photograph, and identifying these materials can be extremely helpful in figuring out the process, as well as providing further clues. Metal was used on very early processes like tintype, and paper is actually the most common material used to print images of photographs. Number 8, observe the color tone of the image. Though this can sometimes be a little bit misleading, if combined with other clues, it can be extremely helpful. In general, worm images are found on photographs from the 1860s to the 1910s. Neutral black and white photographs are more commonly encountered on photographs made from the late 1890s to the present day. And it might just be good to look a little closer at it and say, is it tinted? Is it colorized? Does it have, is it in black and white? These things can all be extremely helpful. Step 9, examine the surface characteristic. Using a light source to look at a photograph may often provide clues as to when it was made. Is the surface reflective? Is it glossy? Is it matte? Is it hand tinted? The very first photographs are on salted paper prints, but do not actually have a reflective surface because they do not have an extra layer on top of the paper. With the introduction of album photography, surfaces became glossier. Photographs with matte surfaces came back into fashion in the late 1890s. And tinting, which is used in many 19th century and even 20th century photographs, can easily be spotted, especially if a light source is used on a 180-degree angle. I know it's a little hard to do a show and tell on a virtual presentation, but I wanted to show something that may be helpful. So this is a photograph. Oh, I don't think I can share this, but I will go to the next slide and come back to this in a second. And then finally, step 10, look for signs of deterioration. Is the image faded or deteriorated? This may help provide clues. For example, because they are made on thin sheets of iron, tin types often show evidence of rust spots or blisters on the surface where the enamel has started to lift off. Does it smell like vinegar? Then it may be safety film. And some additional tips to help you identify photographs. Does it have decorative borders, scalloped borders? Are the edges round or square? So the image on the left was the one I was trying to show you. It is a hand-tinted photograph, most likely from the 40s. If you hold it up to the light, which is a little bit hard to see from this angle, you can see that certain portions are actually easy to see where the hand tinting might have been done, especially her lips. And I also know that this is from the mid-40s because she married my grandfather in 1947. And my mom also has several photographs of her at home that were tinted. Color photography didn't really become popular until the 1950s, maybe even 1960s. So I know that this photograph dates before that. The photograph on the right is a photograph of my grandparents on my father's side. And if you look at the photograph, you may notice it has ruffled edges. Another way of helping to identify photographs, photographs with ruffled edges were fairly common in the 40s, and this most likely dates from 1940s. So I've talked a little bit about how to identify and date photographs, as well as different types of photographs, and hopefully given you the clues and tools you may need to uncover family secrets of your own. And now I'm going to talk about the care and preservation of photographs and give you a few simple tips on how you can best take care of them. I titled this part of the presentation the do's and don'ts of photo preservation, largely because they're fairly practical solutions that almost anyone can use. And I always think that common sense is usually the best approach. So step 1, and one last thing to note is that photographs are highly susceptible to heat, light, and humidity. And if you remember nothing else about this presentation, the first bullet point is the most important. Do consider moving photographs out of an attic, basement, or garage. Yes, I know photographs take up space, Yes, I know it's easier to store them in an attic, basement, or garage, but unfortunately, basements flood and can get damp, which is not great for photographs. Attics tend to be very hot, and a garage is susceptible to all three. So where should you store them? Preferably in your living room, maybe away from a heater, or even on a bookshelf. I have heard stories of people storing photographs in the freezer, but I wouldn't suggest that you go that far. A living room is perfectly fine. Do you keep scrapbooks in an archival paper box? Um, Quite a few of us have scrapbooks, either older family scrapbooks or perhaps ones that you have made with your kids when you were younger, or maybe ones that you made with your parents. A scrapbook is something quite remarkable. Separately, the photographs don't really have a connection to one another, but combined together, they have a theme. And it's a collection and really should be treated as such. I would recommend that you don't dismantle a scrapbook, as it does have an intrinsic value being kept together. And probably the best place to keep it would be an archival box with tissue paper on the side to help keep it in place. After this presentation, I'm going to show you an example of an archival box, just so you get a little bit more sense of what it might look like. Do keep photographs in plastic sleeves and consider storing them in an archival paper box or a 3-ring binder with plastic sleeves. Why an archival box? Well, normal paper has acid in it that could potentially damage photographs, although a box does have the ability to block dirt, light, and dust. It is not uncommon for photographs to be stored in a shoebox, but a shoebox does get dusty, cardboard can be fragile, and eventually it will fall apart. Why plastic sleeves? Plastic sleeves help preserve the photograph. It is one of the most common ways to damage a photograph is by putting your fingers on them. There's oil, dirt, and grease, and it's very easy to leave a fingerprint on them or damage them. And a 3-ring binder is just a very practical way of storing photographs. And one of the things that I really want to give you tonight are practical solutions. Do you consider putting a photograph in an archival envelope, especially if it is fragile or damaged? Archival envelope is an acid-free envelope that will protect photos from heat, light, and dirt. Don't, now we go to the don'ts. Don't laminate your photographs. They need to be able to breathe. This was a fairly common thing to do, and I'm actually pretty sure that my mom still has a couple of laminated photographs at home. Don't use glue, sticky tape, or other adhesives. Glue, sticky tape, and adhesives can damage the photograph and may unfortunately almost tear it. Do include information about a photograph. Use an index card or by writing on the back of the photograph with a number 2 pencil. The reason for this is obviously an archival, a number 2 pencil, as pens smear and ink fades. And archival practices always say use a number 2 pencil. Additionally, you may know that the photograph is a picture of you of your 9th birthday, where your mom made your favorite cake and you got your favorite present. However, someone else might not necessarily know that in the future, and the story behind it will be lost. And the last step is don't panic. Practical solutions are sometimes the best solutions. If you use glue, sticky tape, or other adhesives, or have laminated your photographs, they are probably perfectly fine. I am also just going to say you may want to reconsider doing this moving forward. And also, if your photos are in the attic, garage, or basement, you can always move them to a more secure location, but obviously sooner is better than later. So let's talk about digitization. To digitize or not to digitize, that is a question. Scanners and technology in general have gotten significantly better in more recent years, and many people have access to technology that would have been out of reach or even terribly expensive 15 years ago. So I will potentially talk about digitization as well as digitization best practices in a potential future workshop. But for this purpose, I'm going to list the pros and cons as to why you should digitize or not digitize. So the first one, easily accessible and easily shared. You can make as many copies as you want without damaging the original photograph. This is fairly straightforward. You can scan a photo and send a copy to your cousin or your aunt or even your dad who lives in a different state. You can print it out into a physical copy. And you can do this many, many, many times without damaging the integrity of the original object. In case of national disasters, fires, floods, earthquakes, you have backups. Remember what I said earlier about not storing your photos in the basement, garage, or attic? This is one of the reasons basements flood, but global warming is becoming more and more serious. If you digitize your photos, store them in the cloud, and say a natural disaster happens and damages or destroys the original, you do have copies and your photographs are preserved. They take up very little physical space. Everything is in the cloud. Photographs take up space, obviously, but once they're digitized, they can be stored in the cloud and you can put as many photographs there as you want. You can use Photoshop to make alterations or corrections if the photograph is damaged or it needs a touch-up. Technology is really remarkable, and you can use Photoshop to really do a lot with older photographs. And I know that I believe that there's even a new filter that can make an old photograph look new, or at the very least, restore it to its original state. So cons is it's always good to acknowledge the flip side of the coin. This is a quote from the New York Times that I really, really liked. We don't know what form digital photography is going to take in 100 years, or whether our grandchildren are going to be able to access our hard drives or cloud accounts. This is a really good consideration. Are we still going to be able to access hard drives in 100 years or even cloud accounts? And are photographs even going to be stored on that same type of technology? On the same topic, technology quickly becomes outdated. Does anyone remember VHS tapes, laser discs, or even reel-to-reel tapes? Well, they are a form of technology. You have to use a specific device to even access or play the material. And not all of them are readily accessible or even easy to find. There's certainly a lot more examples that I can think of, but these are the more relevant ones. And I would also ask, is it wise to put all of our eggs into one basket? Natural disaster aside, if a photograph is stored properly, it should last another 100 years. But will a digitized photograph still be accessible in 100 years? That's a really, really good question to ask. And lastly, physical objects have a special quality about them that don't quite translate to digital. I am not a Luddite, but there is something just really wonderful about seeing the integrity, the physical integrity of an object versus something that's digital. Perhaps it's just our own inclination for physical objects, or even just the act of holding something in your hand, but I really do believe that there is a considerable difference. So this, oh, pardon me, I clicked on the wrong thing. Okay, there we go. We get back to that slide. Technical difficulties. Hmm. Okay, one more. There we go. So this last section, or I should say second to last section, is called But Facebook. And I feel that this is inevitable whenever digitization or digitization best practices are discussed, that someone will or may say, why should I do that? My photos are on Facebook and preserved forever. So I wanted to address this a little bit. Personally, I think Facebook is a great resource. You can share photographs with your community, with your family, as well as make the material publicly accessible. And from an archivist perspective, yes, I certainly want you to put out more history and content into the world and make sure as many people as possible have access to that. However, there are several considerations. How much detail or parts of a photograph are being shown? When a photograph is uploaded, there are many things that may be lost, including potential handwriting on the back or even information that could be incredibly important. So oh, I wanted to use this photo as a case study. And one of the reasons I am showing you this image is almost as a demonstration that photographs aren't just two-dimensional. And I didn't add a title because I really just wanted you to focus on the photograph. So this is a photograph of my grandfather, and it may seem like it's small, but it's actually quite large. It is, I would say, the size of a small book. And where was this photograph taken? Most likely in the early 50s at Curtis Studios in Los Angeles. If the name sounds familiar, it's the same Edward S. Curtis that also operated a photography studio in Seattle and was known for his photographs of American Indians. He also worked briefly in Hollywood and opened a studio in Los Angeles in the late 1920s. And again, he passed away in 1952. My grandfather was born in the 20s, so I can also assume this photograph was taken in the late 40s, early 50s, or at least prior to 1952. So I also know this is Edward S. Curtis, as in Curtis Studios, because during my research putting this presentation together, I came across a letter addressed from Beth Curtis Magnuson, Edward Curtis's daughter, that had the exact same type of logo on the letter. So Curtis Studio was also a very prestigious studio. So it's most likely that my grandfather had money, which he certainly did. And I, again, wanted to use this as a case study to demonstrate that it's extremely easy to overlook this type of information, especially if a photo is just posted on social media. And taking all of these things into consideration certainly makes for a much more interesting and even richer story. So I wanted to end this presentation by giving you some resources that might be helpful. I'm also going to include this in the supplementary slides I will be sending out after the presentation. Moon Photo Lab is a local company specializing in digitization, retouching, restoration, as well as making archival copies of photographs. And the following are places where you can buy photo sleeves and archival boxes. B&H Photo is a fantastic photography store in New York and sells a wide range of supplies in addition to cameras and camera equipment. So here I've listed archival sleeves as well as photo boxes. Gaylord Archival, or Gaylord, is a company that sells museum quality archival material. I've also listed boxes as well as sleeves. And lastly, I've listed Amazon because archival supplies can be quite costly, and Amazon is actually a very good suggestion if you don't necessarily have the money to spend on supplies, but you still want to preserve your photographs. Great. So thank you very much. If anyone has any questions, you're welcome to email me at archivist@WashingtonStateJewishHistoricalSociety.org. And this is a photo from a scrapbook. And I unfortunately don't have any information as to who these people might be, but I believe this is from my grandmother on my dad's side, and the photo is probably from the 1920s. Before I open things up to questions, Lisa, Cora, did you want to say a little bit more about the annual meeting in November?
Sure. Hi, I'm Lisa Kranzler. I'm the executive director. And thank you all for being here. Thank you to Marissa for this wonderful presentation. Beautiful, beautiful slides and very special memories she has shared of her grandmother. And I hope that it will inspire all of you to dig out some of those old photos as well and start dating them and other preservation efforts. Our annual meeting for the Washington State Jewish Historical Society is coming right up a few weeks on November 16th, and registration is right on our home front page, as well as WSJHS.org/events. And we hope to see you all there. It's very exciting. We've been featuring different Jewish community leaders, and we'll be featuring Miri Cyphers from the ADL. Anti-Defamation League, and we're excited to have her. We've done her oral history, and we'll be having her hosted live as well as all the typical things at the annual meeting, the installation of new officers, and a very special award to our volunteer of the year, who actually hasn't been announced officially, but she is here tonight, so think about it. Back to you, Marissa.
Okay.
Up to everyone else.
Perfect. One more thing I wanted to do before I open things up for questions is I realize that it is a little bit hard to share things when I am presenting. So I did have some objects to show for show and tell. So I'm going to stop for a moment. Again, this is a little bit hard to do when you're doing a virtual presentation, but I always feel it's good to show this. So this is a archival box. It's a little bit hard to see, but this is something that you might want to consider putting a scrapbook in. This is also called a clamshell box because it opens kind of like this. So this is the photograph of my grandmother that is hand tinted. And if you look at it very closely towards the light, you can really make out just her lips, as well as some of her eyes. And I was looking at this earlier and noticed that she actually doesn't have any lines on her face. So there was probably just a little bit of photo retouching done as well. And the last thing I wanted to share is I had talked a little bit earlier about how it's common for photographs to be stored in an attic or a basement or a garage and even a shoebox. So not quite a shoebox, but certainly a box that does have some photographs in it. And obviously they've been fine for 60 years, but this probably is not the correct place to store it. Okay, so I want to open things up for questions. Does anyone have any questions or that I can answer, or anything that you wanted to share about perhaps your own family photographs?
There was a question, Marissa. You kind of touched on it already, from Leslie. Do you have companies you recommend for digital transfer of film, slides, and photos? And you had mentioned Moon Photo, which I believe is in Ballard.
Yeah, Moon Photo is a good one. I also have some others that I can recommend after the presentation.
Great. And just off the top of my head, there's also Panda Lab downtown.
Oh, great.
If you are interested in learning to develop film yourself, then the Photographic Center Northwest in Capitol Hill is a great place to do that. And I also have a recommendation for an art conservator who specializes in photographs that I can also provide as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kayla, for those resources.
We have a question from Sarah. She says, we have a lot of family photos from the early 1900s to the 1950s that are framed and displayed. Do you recommend storing the photos in an archival way and replacing the original photos on the wall with duplicate images?
Yes. So this is a little tricky because my grandmother had a lot of archival photos that were also stored in frame photographs, and so does my mom. It's actually very easy to get a archival quality reproduction of that, that probably 99.9% of people will not be able to tell the difference. And that's really cool that you have so many family photographs. And it is good to display them, but I would also caution that one of the things that photographs are really susceptible to is light. They can fade, and then also they're in a frame. They can get dusty. So I would recommend that you get archival quality reproductions and store the originals in a safe place in archival boxes with photo sleeves. And actually, I just got a direct message from Joel Ehrenberg, who said, what city did my grandparents get married in the secret slide? So that is my grandparents on my dad's side, my grandmother, Mickey. I don't actually know her real name. I always called her Grandma Mickey, and my grandfather, Tom, and they got married in Los Angeles. So that photograph is in Los Angeles in 1948. I don't know where in Los Angeles, but they got married in Los Angeles.
We have a question from Lisa, and I actually had a similar question. It says, you suggested not dismantling a scrapbook, but what if no one in future generations wants to have these physically large items? And you also mentioned an intrinsic value to scrapbooks. So I was wondering if you could also speak more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So that is a great question. I know that it is very common, and I think not always, that the younger generation doesn't necessarily want the photographs that the older generation has, but I would reconsider. So I say the intrinsic value of a scrapbook is it's really a collection of items, and items that tell a very specific story. I don't have the scrapbook that is from my grandmother in front of me, which would be great to show, but it does share something really special, and dismantling that, you're just going to have a collection of photographs that may not have any connection to one another. One of the things that really breaks my heart is going to a thrift store or a vintage store and seeing a dismantled scrapbook, because you really have something that collectively has so much intrinsic value, and now it's just bits and pieces. So I don't really know the answer to that question. I would say maybe keep it, put it in an archival box, and you don't know if people may want it in the future. Maybe they don't want it now, but in 10, 15 years, that could actually be very valuable to someone. I know that I didn't really appreciate a lot of my own family photos when I was younger. And now I certainly wish that I would have asked my grandparents more about just who they were and who some of my family members were.
Marissa, if I can jump in really quick, another option for the for scrapbooks and things like that. Lisa did kind of touch on the scanning part, which is a great option, is digitizing them. But another option is to donate it to a historical society or a museum.
Yes, that is a fantastic idea, and we are a historical society.
So we have a very important question from B, that is, what does a photo sleeve look like? I think a lot of us probably don't really understand what makes a good photo sleeve and what we shouldn't be using.
Yes. So that is also a great question. And I think one of the downsides to having a presentation in one's own home versus in an archival facility where I could show you what a photo sleeve looks like. So you know what a photo album with like clear, like it's a clear plastic rectangle that you put a photo into. That's basically what a photo sleeve is. So not something fancy, just something that you would put a photo into. Oh, thank you.
And are there ones that are better than others? Like, I'm thinking of the sleeves we used to put baseball cards in and Pokemon cards and that type of thing. Like, are they different than what we would be using for photos?
So that is also a good question. Obviously, there are plastic sleeves that aren't archival. I would recommend archival just because sometimes the plastic can cause photographs to not have great things happen. But I would also it depends on the size of the photograph. If it's a really tiny photograph, you obviously don't want to put it in a huge sleeve. If it's something really big, you want to make sure that fits it completely. And the other thing I would say is if it's damaged, you probably want to put it in an archival envelope. And archival does make things sound a little fancier, but it's just, I would say, a normal envelope that's made out of acid-free paper.
Our next question is from Sarah. Do you have any information about negatives? Should we keep the negatives and how should they be stored?
So that is a great question. I initially put together this presentation with, don't keep negatives, you should get rid of them. But I also realized that, you know what's valuable. I don't know what's valuable in your collection. I can say, oh, you should get rid of this, or this isn't necessarily, but you really know like the intrinsic value of what is meaningful. And I say, if you think that negatives should be kept, then by all means, keep the negatives. If they're not something that you think that should be kept, then don't keep them. In terms of storing, I have heard stories of people storing negatives in freezer. But I do recall that some of my previous archival jobs, we just put them in an acid-free envelope so that they would be protected from light, and also write what the negatives are from, like what they date from, maybe what they depict, just so there's a little bit more information about them.
Sandy is wondering how you feel about creating photo books using mixbook.com with stories, and do you suggest weeding through photos and only keeping the best ones?
So I'm not super familiar with mixbook.com. Is it just like a digital photo album?
Sorry,
No.
it's an actual, you do it digitally, but it's an actual physical photo album that you get with your digital pictures printed out. And they have all kinds of borders and it's a really cool, people do it for their trips or special celebrations.
Yeah, I think that it's a great idea. I talked a lot about historic photographs, but you know the best way to preserve your own memories. And I think that is perfectly reasonable. I would say, yes, it might be good to weed through photos and only keep the best ones. It's very easy to take a lot of photos on your phone and then end up with way too many. But I think it's just good to also consider what people might want to use them for the future. Do you really want 15 photos of your cat? I would, but maybe someone else might necessarily not feel the same way.
Leslie is requesting you to do a session on document storage. So just something to think about for the future. And Sarah,
I can actually respond to that. So we are hoping to offer more workshops like this, hopefully. So we wanted to offer like a 4-part workshop. First one would be on photography and how to store photographs. The second one would be on archival objects like documents and books. And the third one possibly on textiles and objects. And then the last one would be on digitization and digitization best practices. But yes, I really appreciate that comment.
Amazing. Sarah is wondering if we should transfer photos out of those old 80s style albums with the sticky pages and the plastic covers to plastic sleeves.
You said sticky, so the answer is probably yes. Yeah, I mean, every generation had their own way of preserving photographs. Again, I really wish that I had like the 1920s scrapbook that my grandmother had, which probably was cutting edge for the day. But a lot of the photographs are faded and they're all falling apart and the paper is falling apart. So, and also don't be too hard on yourself. Like that probably was the best way to store it at the time. But obviously 40 years later, things have changed. And that's also normal. Technology changes.
Joan is asking if we can stack photos on top of each other, even with pencil writing on the back.
So good question. Answer is no, because it's very easy for photos to stick to each other, and then photos stick to each other and then photos are damaged. Again, probably the best way to store them would be in plastic sleeves. Or I don't have a example of this, but I do know that if the photos are a little older, like a carte de visite, you can actually store them in a postcard box, which is very similar to the archival box that I just showed, except it's a little bit longer and not quite as wide. But yes to the pencil, yes to the pencil.
Would you recommend storing archival boxes inside thick black plastic bins in a controlled temp environment?
No. So photos need to be able to breathe. And the thing with plastic bins is that they are airtight. So no air gets in and out. I would not advise it, but an archival box should be fine. Plastic sleeves might be a little bit of an overkill.
And Leslie is asking, should we take old photos out of old studio frames or photos?
So before that, I noticed that Kayla also responded to that question, saying archival quality tissue paper can also be used to separate photographs when stacked. Yes, that is correct. But I would also say, like, if you stack things on top of each other, the photos could get warped or bent or out of shape. Have you ever stacked records on top of each other? What happens after a while? They become just a little bit not so much. But I'm sorry, Cora, could you repeat the question again?
Absolutely. The question is, should we take old photos out of old studio frames or photos?
It really depends. I would say if you have a ton of them and you want to have a good quality for future use, probably. Just because over time photographs fade and they're not going to have the same quality that they did 30, 40, 50 years ago. But again, I try and use common sense. So don't listen to this lecture and immediately like run home and take all the photographs out of your frame and start panicking. But if something is really valuable, and you may say, oh, I love this photo of my grandfather. Like I always get sentimental when I look at it and it's very meaningful to you, then I would take it out of a frame, probably make an archival copy of it and put that photograph somewhere else.
Are there frames that are better to use if you do want to continue to display your photos?
That is a good question. I would say it's not necessarily the frame. It's more about the exposure to heat and light. If you do put up a photograph on the wall next to a window, the photograph is going to get faded no matter what the frame looks like. And also if you happen to live in a very warm apartment, having a frame isn't really going to protect your photograph from the heat. Kayla, did you have anything to offer on that?
On taking the photos out of frames?
No, it was a question. Are there any frames that photographs should be stored in that wouldn't damage the photograph?
Okay, well, there is always a risk, kind of like you were saying.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
yeah, going to a reputable frame store that uses even archival quality paper and mat board and glass, that will really help, especially with sun damage. One place that I really like to go is Annie's Art and Frame in Ballard. The art conservator that I used to work with recommended that place, and they do a great job. And so there's that reassurance when you make that extra investment to decide to get, UV filtering glass and things like that. So you just have to be careful where you go.
Great. Great for that recommendation. Thank you, Kayla.
Does anyone else have any other questions?
So I did want to, we still have some time, like this presentation ends at 8:15, but I did want to just share one more story, and it's framed in a hallway that has a lot of light in it, but it's my mom's photograph, so I get it. But it's one of the most interesting photographs, I would say, in my family's collection. So about 5 years ago, when I was visiting my grandmother for Thanksgiving, she lived in Texas at the time. My entire family went to the beach, and I was like, I want to stay here and spend some time with my grandma. And then she serendipitously brought out like this giant box of photographs, and we just started going through them. And one of the photographs was this beautiful woman who was in a mechanic's uniform, holding a wrench and under a car hood and looking smilingly, not suggestively, up at the camera. And I said, "Grandma, who is that?" She said, "Oh, that was me." And then she said, "That photo." So apparently she was in the WAC, which is the Women's Army Corps, kind of an early precursor to the Air Force. And they got her to do some modeling. So she had some of these photographs and was a little like, but I thought they were fascinating and kind of funny to look at.
Thank you, Marissa, for that wonderful story. So Kayla has just shared the link to the survey in the chat. So please, if you could click on that before you head out, we would love to hear your thoughts. And thank you so much, Marissa, for this wonderful presentation. If anybody wants to stay on for a few more questions, please do. We're happy to hang out. Otherwise, have a great night.